The second presentation is by Carroll, and his concern is with defining teaching and learning. His presentation will range from philosophical issues such as the traditional views of humanism and today's contemporary view of humanism, through the definition of teaching, especially as provided by Skinner, and the definition of learning, and how these concepts are applied to the development of personalized systems of instruction or self-paced systems of instruction, especially with the use of current technology. I am Dr. Haralamus. I will be talking about a definition of teaching and learning that can be applied to self-paced instruction, especially using technology. One of our concerns is with humanizing education. Too often students are forced to learn at a pace that is not their own. Often, in group settings, students are treated as mere numbers. It is also true that the teacher is forced to present at a particular pace, often trying to hit some middle ground that in reality does not exist. We have students who learn quickly, we have students who learn more slowly. Our goal is to free the teacher so that the teaching does not have to fit a one-size-fits-all model. Let's take a step back and look at humanism and what we mean today by humanism. Humanism began with the Renaissance movement, roughly in the 14th century during the Common Era. Humanism was a reaction to classicism that used standard texts to teach mostly utilitarian topics such as theology, law, and medicine. The term humanista arose in the 15th century and was used to describe a teacher or a student who studied classical literature, the arts, or rhetoric. During the late 16th century's Common Era, the English equivalent humanist appears in the literature. It has a meaning similar to humanista. During the 19th century, the term humanist acquires a different meaning. Humanism, as now construed, is concerned with Greek and Roman literature and how humane values could be derived from these literatures. The concern is also with cultural and educational reform, the idea being that an educated citizenry would more fully participate in civic life. Jumping approximately 150 years or so, we reach approximately the mid of the 20th century, where we see a clash arising between humanism as construed in psychology and radical behaviorism. Humanism in psychology is known as the third force in psychology, and such leaders emerged as Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, Raoul May, and Floyd Matson. Floyd Matson suggested that humanistic psychology is not just the study of human being, rather it is a commitment to human becoming. It is often the case that the humanistic literature in psychology creates such terms, often with very vague definitions and very difficult to study, or in some cases comprehend. In contrast, radical behaviorism adopts a deterministic approach. There are two kinds of determinism that we should be concerned with. One is the hard determinism, or also known as the incompatibilist literature or position. This is concerned with a mechanistic approach to determinism. Different kinds of determinism is what's known as soft determinism or the compatibilist position. The compatibilist position is still deterministic, but is not of the push-pull or the mechanistic variety. B.F. Skinner, the founder of radical behaviorism, often dealt with the issue of determinism. In his 1953 classic text, Science and Human Behavior, Skinner argues that behavior is lawful and determined. Thus, he sets himself in opposition to the humanistic psychologists who believe that behavior is not determined and are less clear on whether behavior is lawful or not. Having to deal with the accusations of a push-pull or mechanistic type of behaviorism, Skinner identified several myths about radical behaviorism. One of these myths is that the human being is seen as an automaton, a robot, or a puppet, or a machine. Skinner clearly rejects such a position. For the interested person, there are many misconceptions about behavior analysis one may follow. In more recent times, Macca has suggested that radical behaviorism has evolved to a more definite probabilistic determinism. In other words, a compatibilist approach to determinism. She argues that behavior is not caused in the traditional manner of viewing cause, in other words, as a push-pull or a mechanistic type approach. Rather, behavior is determined in a functional relationship. In other words, behavior is a function of particular kinds of events. Such events may be modified by other events, thus excluding the possibility of one force A for example, exerting force on event B. Such positions have come in conflict with the third force in psychology. For example, Mattson made this interesting statement in 1971. He suggests that there is no greater disrespect for the human person than to demean that person by fragmenting that person into traits or reflexes or into other mechanical hardware. He argues that this is the very procedure of behaviorism. Radical behaviorism has to deal with the issue. In other words, the issue is, what does it mean to behave humanistically in a deterministic universe? Willard Day, one of the psychologists who replied to Mattson's accusations, suggests that there are clear affinities between radical behaviorism and the humanism of the Renaissance. The humanism of the Renaissance is rather different than the humanism of today's third force psychology. The commonalities that Willard suggests between humanism and radical behaviorism is that both see humans as an aspect of nature. They also suggest that society functions to serve the interests of humans, and that humans do have the power to alter the world, even though this may be a deterministic world. Day's point is that such interventions can lead to the Renaissance person. This is the civic-minded person that the humanists of the 19th century are concerned with. Furthermore, Skinner argued against Mattson's point that a science of behavior does not dehumanize, as Mattson accused radical behaviors, rather it dehomunculizes. This is a term that Skinner used to suggest that taking out magical or mystical forces within the person forces one to look at the interaction between the person and the world. Similarly, MacCorquodale suggests that the true authoritarian is the person who refuses to teach, or the person who does not want to tinker with the world, even if that world includes humans. And in the radical behaviors perspective, humans are part and parcel of this world. He suggests that allowing people... One of the goals then is to decide or to determine what teaching is about. To understand what teaching is all about, we need to understand some of the metaphors that are used to describe human development. All theories of development see a person as interacting with the particular environment that he or she is in. In this example, we see a maturation or a genetic approach to development. In other words, behavior simply evolves out of one's own makeup. The environment can enhance or detract from such development. From the psychosocial or psychosexual approach to development, most of development occurred at some underlying level to which the person did not have access unless with psychoanalytic or psychosocial help. Such a method has frequently been identified as non-scientific because its concepts are simply not verifiable. A third approach arose with Jean Piaget and the constructivist approach. In this approach, the person is basically a scientist who, on one's own, discovers what is going on and creates a particular world out of his or her experiences. The more recent addition to psychology is the information processing approach, where the person is seen as a processing computer with its inputs, throughputs, and outputs. There are obvious implications about teaching and learning from the various metaphors that we have just seen. Skinner argues that in a given environment, left alone, a person will learn. However, the person will not have been taught, and that is a crucial distinction that radical behaviorism makes in contrast to other approaches in psychology. Skinner further suggests that metaphors are conceptually inadequate. The reason that he argues that metaphors are conceptually inadequate is that they do not capture the interchange between the organism and the environment. Skinner proposes an interactionist perspective. In other words, radical behaviorism, he argues, seeks alternatives in one's genetic endowment and in one's environmental history. In other words, the interactions, both social and physical environments with which the person has interacted. Sidney Bijou and Donald Baer use the concepts of both radical behaviorism and the interbehaviorism of Jacob Cantor to define psychological development as progressive changes in interactions between the behavior of an individual and the people, objects, and events in the environment. In other words, we see a very close relationship to what Skinner said and what Bijou and Baer are suggesting what psychological development is all about. There are progressive changes, but these changes come about as the person functions in a particular environment. In other words, we will not see stages of development proposed. Rather, what we will see is a continuous view of development, and the person may be at a considerably different point in one's own development, even though experiences may be similar with other people. And the reason for that is the particular genetic endowment the person brings, along with the particular environmental interactions that that person has. Skinner proposed a selectionist account of behavior. What he meant by this was that behavior is selected by its consequences in a manner similar to Charles Darwin's evolution of biological characteristics by natural selection. Skinner suggests that operant conditioning is selection in progress. What he meant by this is that behavior is continually changing as the person interacts with particular environments. The focus of operant conditioning is on the contingencies of reinforcement. A contingency refers to an occasion when behavior occurs and the consequences that that behavior produces. The contingencies can take place at both the phylogenic and ontogenic level. The primary concern in behavior analysis is the ontogenic level. Putting all this together, Skinner argued that teaching is simply the arrangement of contingencies of reinforcement. What he is concerned with is that the person's behavior, correct behavior, be reinforced so that it is established and increased. Furthermore, he argues that teaching is the expediting of learning. As he noted earlier, learning can occur in any environment, but that is not necessarily teaching. So teaching is the arrangement of contingencies for conditions under which behavior would not otherwise arise.